My Aunt Margaret had always been the family's anchor, steady, unshakable, and utterly self-sufficient. At 53, she had built a life that seemed complete without romance. She owned a charming bookshop in downtown Charleston, lived in a converted carriage house with a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood, and spent her evenings with a rotation of book clubs, volunteer work, and the occasional glass of wine with friends. "Marriage isn't for everyone," she'd say whenever my mother would hint about dating. "I've got my books, my garden, and my peace. What more could I need?" She'd been married once, briefly, in her 20s. It had ended amicably but disappointingly, and since then, she'd dated sporadically through her 30s and early 40s before deciding that solitude suited her better than compromise. By the time she turned 50, the family had stopped asking. Aunt Margaret was simply Aunt Margaret, complete unto herself. I was closer to her than anyone else in the family. At 28, I'd recently moved back to Charleston after a painful divorce, and Aunt Margaret had been my refuge. She never pitied me or offered platitudes. Instead, she gave me a job at her bookshop and taught me that being alone didn't mean being lonely. "You're going to be fine, Sophie," she told me one afternoon as we unpacked boxes of new arrivals. "Better than fine. You're going to discover who you are without someone else's expectations crowding you." She seemed to glow with contentment, her silver-streaked auburn hair always swept up in an elegant twist, her green eyes bright with purpose. She wore flowing linen dresses and statement necklaces, moved through her days with unhurried grace, and radiated the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. So when everything changed that autumn, it caught us all by surprise. It started on a Tuesday in October, one of those perfect fall days when Charleston's humidity finally breaks and the air carries the promise of cooler weather. I was shelving books in the poetry section when I heard the bell above the door chime. "I'll get it," Aunt Margaret called from her office at the back of the shop. I heard her footsteps, then suddenly, silence. The kind of silence that makes you look up. I peered around the bookshelf and saw a tall man with silver hair standing just inside the door, holding a worn leather satchel. He was staring at Aunt Margaret, and she was staring back, her hand frozen on the counter. "Maggie?" His voice was deep, uncertain. "James?" She breathed the name like a question and an answer at once. I watched, fascinated, as a flush crept up my aunt's neck, something I'd never seen before. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous gesture completely unlike her usual composure. I can't believe it's you," she said. "How long has it been?" 32 years. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Not that I was counting. They stood there for a long moment, the air between them crackling with something I couldn't quite name. Finally, Aunt Margaret seemed to remember where she was. "What brings you to Charleston?" "To my shop? I moved here 3 months ago." "Retirement," he said, shifting the satchel on his shoulder. "I've been meaning to come by ever since I heard about your bookshop. Everyone in town talks about it. I should have known it would be you. You always did love books. Come in, please. Can I make you some tea? Coffee?" She was talking too fast, her hands fluttering. My composed, unflappable aunt was actually flustered. I made myself scarce, retreating to the back room, but I kept the door cracked so I could hear. I wasn't proud of my eavesdropping, but I'd never seen Aunt Margaret like this. They talked for over 2 hours. I learned that James Thornton had been her boyfriend in college before her brief marriage. They'd been deeply in love, planning a future together, but had broken up over something neither of them fully explained in that first conversation. He'd gone on to marry, have 2 children, build a career as an architect. His wife had passed away 4 years ago after a long illness. His children were grown, settled in their own lives, and he'd decided to start fresh in Charleston, a city he'd always loved. "And you?" he asked. "I heard through the grapevine that you married." "Oh, that." Aunt Margaret laughed, but there was something wistful in it. Ancient history. It lasted less than 3 years. Turned out I was better at being alone. "I don't believe that," James said quietly. "You were always meant to be loved, Maggie. You just needed the right person." The silence that followed was so charged I could feel it from my hiding spot. Finally, Aunt Margaret cleared her throat. "Tell me about your work. Did you design anything I might have seen?" They moved on to safer topics, but the undercurrent remained. When James finally left, promising to return soon, Aunt Margaret stood by the door for a long time, her hand pressed to her chest. I emerged from the back room, pretending I'd been working the whole time. "Old friend?" She turned to me and her eyes were bright. With tears or wonder, I couldn't tell. "The oldest. The first, really." "First what?" "First love." She said it simply, like stating a fact. I haven't thought about him in years. I trained myself not to. And then he walks in here like no time has passed at all. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head, but she was smiling. "Not yet. I don't even know what it is. He's just an old friend." But the way she said it, I knew he was so much more than that. James came back the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, he was a regular fixture at the bookshop, always arriving in the late afternoon, always finding some reason to browse the shelves or ask Aunt Margaret's recommendation on a book. "I'm catching up on everything I should have read," he explained to me once. "Maggie always did have better taste than me." I watched their dance with fascination. They were cautious with each other, careful not to presume too much or move too fast. They talked about books, about Charleston's history, about the garden Aunt Margaret was planning for spring. They avoided talking about the past or the future, staying safely in the present. But I could see what was happening. It was in the way Aunt Margaret started wearing her favorite jewelry again, how she'd glance at the door around 3 o'clock every afternoon. It was in the way James's face would light up when he saw her, how he'd find excuses to brush her hand when she handed him a book. "You should ask him to dinner," I suggested one evening as we closed up the shop. "Don't be ridiculous," Aunt Margaret said, but she was blushing. "We're just renewing an old friendship." And I'm the Queen of England." She laughed, despite herself. "Sophie, I'm 53 years old. I don't do teenage butterflies and first-date nerves anymore." "Could have fooled me," I said gently. "Aunt Margaret, there's nothing wrong with this. With him. You're allowed to feel whatever you're feeling." She was quiet for a moment, organizing the receipts with unnecessary precision. "I haven't felt this way in 30 years, she finally admitted. "And the last time I did, it ended in heartbreak. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to go through that again." "What happened? Why did you break up?" She sighed, setting down the papers. "We wanted different things. Or I thought we did. James had this opportunity, a prestigious architecture program in London. It was his dream. But I had just gotten accepted to graduate school here and my mother was sick. I couldn't leave, and I didn't want to ask him to give up his dream for me." "So you broke up?" "We tried long distance for a while, but it was too hard." The time difference, the distance, the cost of calls back then. Eventually, we just drifted apart. He met Catherine in London. I met Richard and thought maybe I could love someone else the same way. She smiled sadly. I couldn't. Richard deserved better, and we both knew it. "And you've been alone ever since." "I've been independent since," she corrected. "There's a difference. I built a good life, Sophie. I don't regret it." But, she admitted, "I forgot what it felt like to have someone look at me the way James does. Like I'm the most interesting person in the world. Like he's been waiting 32 years to tell me about his day." "So, what are you going to do about it?" She looked at me, uncertain for perhaps the first time since I'd known her. "I have no idea." In the end, James was the one who made the first move. A week later, as Aunt Margaret was recommending a biography of Frank Lloyd Wright, he interrupted her mid-sentence. "Maggie, would you have dinner with me?" She froze, the book suspended between them. "Dinner?" "Yes, an actual date, not just coffee in the bookshop or accidentally running into each other at the farmer's market." He smiled. "I'm too old to play games. I'd like to take you to dinner, a proper date." I was shelving books nearby and I swear I stopped breathing. Aunt Margaret set the book down carefully. James, I don't know if that's a good idea. Why not? Because, she gestured helplessly. Because we're not kids anymore. Because it's been 30 years. Because I don't know how to do this. Neither do I, he said simply. Catherine was the only woman I dated after you. I've been out of practice for decades, but I know I want to spend more time with you. I know that I think about you when I'm not here. I know that I haven't felt this way since you. The vulnerability in his voice was almost painful to hear. Aunt Margaret's eyes filled with tears. We broke each other's hearts once, she whispered. We were kids who made the best decisions we could with the information we had, he countered. We're not those people anymore, Maggie. We've lived whole lives. We've loved other people, buried people we loved, raised children, built careers. We know what matters now. And what matters? Not wasting time, he said firmly. Not walking away from something real because we're afraid. Not being too proud or too scared to take a chance. Aunt Margaret was crying now, but she was also smiling. You always were persuasive. Is that a yes? That's a yes. I might have actually cheered from behind the bookshelf. Aunt Margaret shot me a look that was equal parts exasperated and delighted, and I ducked out of sight, grinning. Aunt Margaret spent an hour getting ready for their date, which I knew was significant because she usually took 10 minutes. She tried on 5 different dresses before settling on a deep blue silk that brought out her eyes. She even let me talk her into wearing her hair down instead of in her usual twist. I feel ridiculous, she said, studying herself in the mirror, like a teenager getting ready for prom. You look beautiful, I told her honestly. Aunt Margaret, you're glowing. She was. There was a light in her eyes, a softness to her expression that I'd never seen before. She looked younger, more open, like some protective shell had cracked open to reveal someone tender underneath. When James picked her up at 7, the look on his face was worth documenting. He stood in the doorway of her carriage house, holding a bouquet of autumn flowers, and just stared. Maggie, he said softly. You're stunning. She blushed like she was 21 again. You're not so bad yourself. He dressed carefully, too. A navy blazer, crisp white shirt, no tie. Distinguished but not stuffy. They looked, I thought, like they belonged together. I shooed them out the door, promising to lock up the bookshop and feed her cat. As I watched them walk to his car, James's hand hovering protectively at the small of her back without quite touching, I felt a wave of unexpected emotion. This was my aunt who'd seemed content alone, who'd built walls so thick I'd thought nothing could penetrate them. And here she was, vulnerable and hopeful, taking a chance on love at 53. They went to a small Italian restaurant on the waterfront, one of those places with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. Later, Aunt Margaret would tell me everything. We talked for 3 hours, she said, curled up on her couch with a cup of tea, still wearing the blue dress. About everything. Our marriages, our losses, our children. Well, his children. The lives we'd lived apart. Was it sad? Sometimes. But mostly it was healing. She set down her tea, struggling to find the words. We were so young when we fell in love, Sophie. We had all these ideas about what love should be, what we should want, but we didn't really know ourselves yet. And now? Now we know exactly who we are. We've had time to become fully ourselves. And the remarkable thing is, she smiled, that soft, wondering smile. We still fit. Maybe better than before, because we're not trying to be anything other than what we are. Did he kiss you? She laughed. Sophie. Well? He walked me to my door, she said, her cheeks pink. And he took my hand, and he said, Maggie, I need you to know something. I'm not here to play games or have a casual fling. I'm too old for that, and life's too short. I want to build something real with you if you'll let me. But only if you want the same thing. And you said? I said yes. And then he kissed me. She touched her lips, marveling. And it was like coming home. Chapter 6. The family weighs in. News of Aunt Margaret's romance spread through the family like wildfire. My mother, her sister, called within 24 hours. Mom, I don't know how you heard already, but yes, she went on one date. Is this the James, the college boyfriend? My mother's voice was equal parts excited and concerned. Sophie, I remember him. She was devastated when they broke up, absolutely devastated. What if he breaks her heart again? What if he doesn't? What if this is exactly what she needs? She's been alone for so long. She's set in her ways. Dating is complicated at any age, but at 53. Mom, she's happy. Isn't that what matters? But I understood my mother's concern. Change at any age is scary, but there's something particularly vulnerable about opening yourself to love later in life. You have more to lose, more established routines, more carefully constructed defenses, more awareness of all the ways things can go wrong. The rest of the family had opinions too. My uncle thought it was wonderful. My grandmother, at 87, was thrilled. About time, she said firmly. Margaret's been hiding behind those books for too long. A woman needs romance, even at 53, especially at 53. My cousin Sarah, ever the pragmatist, had questions. What if it doesn't work out? What if he's different than she remembers? What if they're just romanticizing the past? But Aunt Margaret was remarkably calm about all the attention. Let them talk, she said. I'm not making any decisions based on what anyone else thinks. Not anymore. Over the next few weeks, I watched Aunt Margaret and James rediscover each other. They took long walks through historic Charleston, toured gardens, visited galleries. James cooked her dinner at his townhouse. He'd learned to cook after Catherine got sick, he explained, and had discovered he enjoyed it. Aunt Margaret invited him to her book club, where he charmed all her friends with his thoughtful observations about the novel they'd read. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. One evening, about a month into their renewed relationship, Aunt Margaret came into the bookshop looking troubled. What's wrong? I asked immediately. She sank into the chair behind the counter. I'm being ridiculous. Tell me anyway. James mentioned that his daughter is coming to visit next week. She wants to meet me. She laughed, but it sounded strained. I'm 53 years old and I'm terrified of meeting my boyfriend's daughter. That's not ridiculous at all. It is. I've given presentations to hundreds of people. I've negotiated with difficult publishers. I've buried loved ones and started businesses and survived a divorce. Why am I scared of meeting a 30-year-old woman? Because it matters, I said simply. Because you care about James, and his children are important to him. You want them to like you. So, what if they think I'm trying to replace their mother? Are you? Of course not. Catherine was clearly a wonderful woman. James loved her deeply. I would never. Then they'll see that, I interrupted. Aunt Margaret, anyone who spends 5 minutes with you and James can see that this is real, that you care about each other. His children want him to be happy. She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. This was new territory, not just dating, but dating someone with a whole established life, adult children, decades of history she hadn't been part of. The meeting with James's daughter, Emma, went better than expected. Emma was warm and gracious, clearly protective of her father, but willing to see that Aunt Margaret made him happy. He's different with you, Emma told Aunt Margaret over lunch. Lighter. He's been so sad since Mom died. Not that he doesn't still miss her. I'm sure he always will. But with you, he smiles again. Really smiles. Aunt Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'm not trying to take her place. I know, Emma said kindly. And I appreciate that. But Mom would want Dad to be happy. She told him so, actually, before she died. She made him promise he wouldn't spend the rest of his life alone. That evening, James's son called from Seattle. His conversation with Aunt Margaret was briefer but equally kind. By the end of the week, both of James's children had given their blessing. They're good people, Aunt Margaret said, marveling. He and Catherine raised good people. And now they get to see him happy, I said. That's a gift, Aunt Margaret. For all of you. As autumn deepened into winter, Aunt Margaret and James's relationship deepened too. They fell into comfortable routines. Saturday morning breakfasts at her favorite cafe, Sunday afternoon walks, weeknight dinners at one or the other's home. The bookshop became a refuge for both of them, a place where they could exist together in comfortable silence, surrounded by stories. But occasionally, old fears and hurts would surface. One evening in late November, I found Aunt Margaret crying in the back office of the bookshop. "What happened?" I asked, alarmed. I'd rarely seen her cry. "Nothing. Everything." She wiped her eyes angrily. "I'm being stupid." "Tell me." She took a shaky breath. "James mentioned that he's going to visit Emma for Christmas. Just casually, while we were making coffee, and suddenly I felt left out, abandoned, like I did 30 years ago when he went to London." "Did you tell him that?" "No, because it's irrational. His daughter wants him to visit. It's been his tradition since his grandchildren were born. I have no right to feel hurt." "But you do feel hurt." "Yes," she admitted. "And it terrifies me. I thought I was past this. I thought I'd learned not to need anyone this much." I pulled up a chair beside her. "Aunt Margaret, you're not that 21-year-old woman anymore. And James isn't leaving you. He's visiting his daughter for the holidays. That's different." "I know that logically." "So what are you really afraid of?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm afraid of loving him this much. I'm afraid that I've given him the power to hurt me. I'm afraid that I'm too old to be this vulnerable." "Did James give you any reason to think he's not fully committed to this relationship?" "No. He's been nothing but wonderful." "Then maybe," I said gently, "the problem isn't James. Maybe it's that you need to trust yourself. Trust that you can handle whatever happens. Trust that letting yourself love him is worth the risk." She nodded slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. But 30 years of self-sufficiency is a hard habit to break." That evening, she called James and told him everything about her fears, her old wounds, her moment of panic. Later, she told me what he'd said. He listened to all of it. And then he said, "Maggie, I'm not going anywhere. Not for Christmas, not ever. Not unless you want me to. I understand being scared. I'm scared too. But I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this goes. We missed out on 30 years. Let's not miss out on whatever time we have left." And then? "And then he asked me to come with him to Emma's for Christmas. If I wanted to. He said Emma would love to have me and he couldn't imagine celebrating the holiday without me." She was crying again, but this time from happiness. I said yes. Christmas at Emma's house in Savannah was a revelation. Emma and her husband had 2 children, a 6-year-old girl named Lily and a 3-year-old boy named Jack. The house was cheerfully chaotic, full of noise and laughter and the beautiful mess of family life. Aunt Margaret, who had never had children of her own and had always claimed she didn't mind, was enchanted. I saw photos she sent, Lily sitting on her lap while Aunt Margaret read her a story, Jack dragging her by the hand to see his toy trains, all of them decorating cookies together in a kitchen covered in flour and sprinkles. "I never knew," she told me when she got back, her voice full of wonder. "I never knew what I was missing." "Are you sad about it?" I asked carefully. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly I'm just grateful. I get to be part of their lives now. Emma's already talking about visiting Charleston in the spring, bringing the kids to the bookshop. And James." She smiled. "James is such a wonderful grandfather. Watching him with Lily and Jack, I fell in love with him all over again." Something had shifted in her over the holidays. She seemed more settled, more certain. The fear that had plagued her in November had been replaced by a quiet confidence. "I've made a decision," she announced one morning in early January. "I'm going to stop being afraid. Whatever happens with James, it's worth it. This feeling, this connection, it's worth the risk." What changed? I did. Or maybe I just remembered who I used to be before I built all these walls. She looked at me seriously. Sophie, I spent 20 years telling myself that being alone was enough. And it was. I wasn't lying about that. I built a good life. But I was also hiding. I was so afraid of being hurt again that I never let anyone close enough to hurt me. And now? Now I know that being hurt is just part of loving people. You can't have one without risking the other. And James is worth the risk. Chapter 10. The Proposal. Spring came early to Charleston that year. By March, the city was awash in azaleas and dogwood blossoms. Aunt Margaret's garden exploded with color, roses and irises and the wisteria vine that draped over her garden gate. She and James spent hours in the garden together, him helping with the heavy work, both of them planning what to plant next year. Next year. She said it so casually, but I heard the weight of it. They were making plans, building a future together. On the evening of her 54th birthday, James took her to their favorite restaurant on the waterfront. It was the same place they'd gone on their first date 6 months earlier. This time, I didn't find out what happened until the next morning when Aunt Margaret burst into the bookshop, waving her left hand. On her ring finger was a simple, elegant diamond ring. "Oh my God!" I screamed, and several customers looked over in alarm. I didn't care. "He proposed!" "He proposed," she confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. I said yes. I actually said yes. I'm getting married at 54. I hugged her, and she held on tight. When she pulled back, her face was radiant. "Tell me everything," I demanded. She pulled me to the back office away from the customers, practically bubbling with excitement. My dignified, composed aunt was bubbling. We finished dinner, and we were walking along the water, and he stopped at this bench overlooking the harbor, and he said, "Maggie, this is where I sat the first week I moved to Charleston." I was so lonely. I missed Catherine. I missed my kids. I didn't know anyone here. And I thought about you. I wondered what would have happened if I'd never gone to London, if I'd stayed and married you instead, if we'd had 30 years together instead of apart. She paused, wiping her eyes. And then he said, "I can't get those years back. But we have now. We have whatever time we're given, and I don't want to waste a single day of it. So will you marry me? Will you build the rest of our lives together?" What did you say? I said yes immediately, and then I burst into tears. And then I laughed. And then we sat on that bench for an hour, just holding each other and watching the water and talking about the future. "I'm so happy for you," I said honestly. "You deserve this. You deserve all of it." "You know what the amazing thing is?" she said. "I actually believe that now. For so long I told myself I didn't need this, that I was complete on my own. And I was, in a way. But this..." She looked at the ring on her finger. "This is better. Not because I need James to complete me, but because choosing to share my life with someone, choosing to be vulnerable and open and loving, that's made me more myself, not less." They decided on a small wedding in June in Aunt Margaret's garden. Just family and close friends, an intimate ceremony under the wisteria vine. Aunt Margaret refused to get caught up in wedding stress. "I'm 54 years old," she said firmly when my mother tried to push for a bigger event. "I'm not having a circus. This is about me and James, not about impressing anyone." But she was excited, in her quiet way. She chose a simple ivory dress, elegant and age-appropriate. She planned a menu with her favorite caterer. She selected readings for the ceremony that made her cry when she practiced reading them aloud. More significantly, they were planning their life together. They decided that James would move into Aunt Margaret's carriage house. It was larger and had the garden they both loved. James would keep his townhouse and convert it into a combined studio and workshop, a place where he could still do some consulting work, and she could escape when she needed quiet time to read. "We're not 20, Aunt Margaret explained. "We both need our own space sometimes. We're not trying to merge into one person. We're two complete people choosing to build a life together." They talked about traveling, all the places they wanted to see. James wanted to take her to London, to show her the city where he'd lived for so many years. Aunt Margaret wanted to visit Italy, to see the architecture and art they'd both studied but never seen in person. They made lists and looked at maps and dreamed together, but they also talked about the practical things, about finances and insurance, and what would happen when one of them got sick or needed care, about their wills and their families and making sure everyone was protected. "We're planning for a life together," Aunt Margaret told me, "not just a wedding. That's the difference between getting married in your 20s and getting married in your 50s. We know that life isn't always romantic. We know there will be hard times, but we're going into this with our eyes open." In May, about a month before the wedding, James received difficult news. His former brother-in-law, Catherine's brother, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. James flew to Boston to be with him and Catherine's family. He was gone for 2 weeks, and when he came back, he was withdrawn and sad. Aunt Margaret gave him space at first, but after a few days of him canceling dinner plans and barely responding to texts, she showed up at his townhouse. "What's going on?" she asked, finding him sitting in his studio, staring at an unfinished drawing. "I can't stop thinking about Catherine," he said quietly. "Being with her family, seeing her brother dying the same way she did. It brought it all back." "Of course it did." "I feel guilty," he admitted. "I'm about to marry you, to start this new life, and all I can think about is her. How much I miss her. How much it still hurts that she's gone." Aunt Margaret sat down beside him. "James, look at me." He did, his eyes full of pain. "I'm not threatened by Catherine," she said firmly. "I'm not competing with her memory. You loved her. You had a whole life with her. She gave you children and decades of partnership. That doesn't just go away because she died or because you fell in love with me. But how can I marry you when I'm still grieving her? Because grief doesn't have an expiration date. Because loving someone new doesn't mean you stop loving someone you've lost." She took his hand. "James, I don't expect you to forget Catherine. I don't even want you to. She was part of making you who you are. The fact that you loved her so deeply, that you cared for her so tenderly through her illness, that's part of why I love you. You're not upset that I'm thinking about her right before our wedding?" "No, I'm honored that you're honest enough with me to share your grief." She squeezed his hand. "We're old enough to know that love isn't simple, that we can hold multiple truths at once, that you loved Catherine and you love me, that you miss her and you're excited about our future, that grief and joy can coexist." He pulled her into his arms and held her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," she said simply. "We both deserve this. We both deserve happiness, even though we've known loss. Maybe especially because we've known loss. We know how precious this is." That conversation marked a turning point. James stopped pulling away and instead let Aunt Margaret in. Into his grief, his guilt, his complicated feelings about moving forward. And she met him there, without judgment, with the kind of mature, encompassing love that only comes from having lived long enough to understand that people are complicated and love isn't always tidy. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the kind of June day that feels like a blessing. Aunt Margaret's garden was in full bloom, every flower seemingly opening just for the occasion. I helped her get dressed in her bedroom, smoothing the simple ivory dress over her shoulders, fastening the strand of pearls that had been my grandmother's. Her hair was swept up loosely, with small white roses tucked into the twist. She looked beautiful, not trying to look younger than she was, but fully embracing the woman she had become. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Remarkably calm," she said, surprised. "I thought I'd be nervous, but I'm not. I'm just happy. So incredibly happy." My mother knocked and entered, tears already streaming down her face. "Margaret, you look beautiful." "Don't start crying yet," Aunt Margaret said, laughing. "We haven't even started the ceremony." But my mother couldn't help it. "I never thought I'd see this day. You were so adamant that you didn't need anyone. I didn't need anyone, Aunt Margaret corrected. I chose this. That's the difference. I'm not marrying James because I need him to complete me. I'm marrying him because I want to. Because my life is good on its own, but it's better with him in it. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. James stood under the wisteria arch, wearing a gray suit that brought out his silver hair, looking at Aunt Margaret like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. When she walked down the makeshift aisle, just a path through her garden, his eyes filled with tears. She'd chosen to walk alone, no one giving her away, because as she'd said, I'm giving myself. I'm choosing this. The officiant, an old friend of Aunt Margaret's, kept the ceremony simple and heartfelt. But the vows were what made everyone cry. James went first, his voice strong despite the emotion in his eyes. Maggie, we lost 30 years. We made different choices, lived different lives, loved other people. And I don't regret any of it, because all of it led us back to each other. But I don't want to lose another day. I promise to spend whatever time we're given being honest with you, cherishing you, building a life that makes us both happy. I promise to never take this for granted. I promise to love you with everything I am for whatever time we have left. Then it was Aunt Margaret's turn, and her voice was surprisingly steady. James, when I built my life alone, I thought I was protecting myself. I thought if I didn't need anyone, I couldn't be hurt. But loving you has taught me that being vulnerable isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing we can do. You've taught me that it's never too late to take a chance, to open your heart, to choose love over fear. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your lover. I promise to face retrie continue, whatever comes with you by my side. I promise that we'll never waste the time we've been given. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. When the officiant pronounced them married and James kissed his bride, the small gathering erupted in applause and cheers. At the reception that followed, a simple but elegant dinner under strings of lights in the garden, Emma stood to give a toast. When my dad called to tell me he'd reconnected with someone from his past, I was worried, she admitted. Not because of Maggie, I'd never even met her, but because I'd watched him love my mother so completely, and I'd watched him grieve her so deeply. I didn't know if he had room in his heart for someone new. She paused, looking at Aunt Margaret and James sitting side by side, his hand covering hers on the table. But then I met Maggie, and I understood. She wasn't trying to replace my mom or erase what they had. She was offering something different, a new chapter, a second chance at happiness. And my dad, who I thought might spend the rest of his life in the past, chose the future, chose love, chose to be brave enough to try again. She raised her glass. To Maggie and Dad, may you have many, many years of happiness together. You've both earned it. As the evening wore on and the light faded to a soft twilight, I found Aunt Margaret standing at the edge of the garden, looking out at her guests, her new family, her old friends, all the people who had supported this unlikely love story. Tired? I asked, coming to stand beside her. Not even a little, she said. I feel more alive than I have in years. Any regrets about your single life? She considered the question seriously. No, I needed those years. I needed to learn who I was on my own, to build something that was completely mine. If James and I had gotten back together in our 30s or 40s, it wouldn't have worked. We weren't ready. We hadn't lived enough, heard enough, learned enough. And now we know what matters. Now we're not trying to build a fairy tale. We're building something real, complicated and messy and absolutely wonderful. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. There you are, Mrs. Thornton. She leaned back against him, and the smile on her face was pure contentment. Here I am. The first year of marriage brought adjustments. James moved his things into the carriage house, and they navigated the small conflicts of shared space, his habit of leaving coffee cups everywhere, her need for absolute silence when reading, his early morning wake-up time versus her preference for sleeping in. We're too old and set in our ways for this to be easy, Aunt Margaret admitted to me one afternoon. But we're also old enough to know that relationships take work. that you don't run away the first time things are hard. They established routines and boundaries. James claimed the sunroom as his space, filling it with his drafting table and architecture books. Aunt Margaret kept her bedroom as her sanctuary, the one place where she could retreat when she needed solitude. They learned to give each other space and to come together when it mattered. But there were beautiful moments too. Morning coffee in the garden, companionable silence while they both read, James cooking dinner while Aunt Margaret told him about her day at the bookshop. The way they'd reached for each other in the middle of the night, still marveling that they weren't alone anymore. "It's the little things," James told me once when he stopped by the bookshop. "Coming home and having someone to tell about my day. Making plans for the weekend knowing she'll be there. Having someone who actually wants to hear my stories about the building I saw downtown or the article I read. Catherine and I had that, and I missed it so much after she died. I'm grateful for it every single day with Maggie." They took their first trip together that fall, 2 weeks in Italy, the trip Aunt Margaret had always dreamed of. They sent me photos from Rome, Florence, Venice. In every picture, they were holding hands, their faces bright with joy and discovery. "We're acting like honeymooners," Aunt Margaret texted me from a cafe in Tuscany. "Everyone here thinks we're ridiculous. We don't care." When they returned, sun-bronzed and happy, they brought stories and memories and hundreds of photos. But the best part, Aunt Margaret told me, was the planning. "James wants to go to Japan next year, and I want to see Scotland. And we're both interested in Morocco. We have so many places to see, so many things to do." She paused, her expression turning serious. "We're both aware that our time is finite. We're in our 50s. If we're lucky, we have 30 more years, maybe 40. We're not taking any of it for granted." Chapter 15. The Health Scare. In the spring of their second year of marriage, James had a health scare. What started as fatigue and shortness of breath turned out to be a blockage in one of his arteries. He needed emergency surgery. Aunt Margaret called me from the hospital, her voice steady but strained. "Can you watch the shop for a few days? James is having surgery tomorrow morning." "Of course. Are you okay?" "I have to be," she said simply. "He needs me to be strong." But when I got to the hospital that evening, I found her in the waiting room, her composure finally cracking. She looked up at me with eyes full of fear. "I just got him," she said. "I can't lose him already." "It's not fair." I sat beside her, taking her hand. "The doctors are optimistic, right?" "Yes, but things can go wrong. Catherine was supposed to beat her cancer. She didn't. We're not young, Sophie. Our bodies fail. That's what happens." "Aunt Margaret, I'm terrified," she interrupted. "Not just of losing him, but of what that says about me. I built my whole life around not needing anyone. And now I need him so much that the thought of losing him is unbearable. What does that make me? Weak? Dependent?" "Human," I said firmly. "It makes you human. Loving someone means risking loss. You knew that going in. Knowing it and living it are different things." The surgery went well. James came through strong, and within a week he was home, grumbling about the restrictions and eager to get back to his normal life. But the experience had shaken them both. "We need to talk about this," Aunt Margaret told him one evening as they sat in the garden. "About what happens when one of us gets sick. Really sick. Maggie, no, we need to. I watched you go through that surgery and realized we've been acting like we have forever. We don't. We need to talk about end-of-life care, about what we each want, about how we'll handle it when one of us starts declining." It wasn't an easy conversation, but they had it. They updated their wills, discussed medical directives, made sure they both knew the other's wishes. They acknowledged the reality of aging, that these years they had together, however many they might be, were precious and limited. "But here's what I realized," Aunt Margaret told me later. "Yes, loving James means risking loss, but not loving him would be a loss too. The loss of all this joy, all this connection, all these beautiful everyday moments. I'd rather have whatever time we're given together than protect myself by staying alone." James echoed the sentiment. "After Catherine died, I thought maybe I'd had my share of love, that it would be greedy to ask for more. But being with Maggie has taught me that love isn't a finite resource. The heart doesn't run out of capacity, and however this ends, whether I go first or she does, I won't regret a single day of loving her. Chapter 16. The Surprise. On Aunt Margaret's 56th birthday, James had a surprise for her. He'd spent months working on it in secret, using his townhouse studio so she wouldn't discover what he was doing. He brought her to the studio blindfolded, which she protested the entire way. "James, this is ridiculous. I'm 56, not 16. "Just humor me," he said, laughing. When he removed the blindfold, she gasped. On his drafting table was a set of architectural plans, detailed, beautiful drawings of a renovation to her carriage house. "What is this?" "Look closer," he urged. She bent over the plans, studying them. Slowly, her hand came to her mouth. He'd designed an expansion, a conservatory addition off the back of the house, glass walls and a glass ceiling, filled with plants and comfortable seating. "You're always saying you wish you could read in the garden year-round," he said softly. "This way you can. It'll be warm in winter, breezy in summer. We can have coffee there in the morning, watch the sunset in the evening. You can fill it with all your favorite plants." "James," she breathed. This is too much." "It's not. Maggie, you gave me a home. You gave me a reason to wake up happy every morning. Let me give this to you. Let me build you a place where you can have the garden and the books and everything you love all in one space." She was crying, but she was also laughing. "When did you have time to do this?" "I've been working on it for months. Emma helped. She's an interior designer, remember? And I got your friend Carol to distract you when I needed to take measurements." He grinned. "It's been a conspiracy." "I love it," she said simply. "I love you." They broke ground in June. The construction took 4 months, and Aunt Margaret supervised every detail, working with James to choose the glass, the flooring, the heating system. By October, it was finished. A beautiful glass conservatory that seemed to bring the garden inside. That first evening in the new space, they sat together as the sun set, bathing everything in golden light. Aunt Margaret had filled it with ferns and orchids and her favorite roses. Books lined the built-in shelves. Comfortable chairs invited hours of reading. "This is perfect," she said, leaning against James. "You're perfect." "I'm really not," he said, kissing her temple. "But I'm perfect for you. And you're perfect for me. That's all that matters." When Emma announced she was pregnant with her 3rd child, Aunt Margaret was surprised by how emotional she felt. She'd never particularly wanted children of her own, or so she'd always told herself. But the idea of another grandchild, even if she was technically just a step-grandmother, filled her with unexpected joy. "Is it weird that I'm excited?" she asked me. "They're not my grandchildren." "Not really." "They love you," I pointed out. "Lily asks about you constantly. Jack draws you pictures. They think of you as their grandmother." "But I didn't raise James. I wasn't there for Emma and Ryan's childhoods. I feel like I'm playing pretend sometimes." "You're not playing pretend. You're building relationships with them. That's real, Aunt Margaret. Just because it came later doesn't make it less valid." When Emma's baby was born, a girl they named Caroline, Aunt Margaret and James flew to Savannah to meet her. In the photos Emma sent, Aunt Margaret was holding the newborn, her face soft with wonder. "I never knew," she told me when they got back. "I never knew what this would feel like. I thought I was fine without it. And I was. I had a good life. But this." She struggled for words. Having these children in my life, watching them grow, being someone they love and trust, it's a gift I never expected. She became more involved in the grandchildren's lives. She sent Lily books for her birthday, taught her to identify different flowers in the garden when they visited. She played trains with Jack for hours, never complaining about the repetition. She rocked baby Caroline while Emma napped, singing old songs she remembered from her own childhood. "You're a natural," James told her, watching her with Caroline. "I'm learning," she corrected. But I love it. I love them. Ryan, James's son, visited with his partner that Thanksgiving, and Aunt Margaret embraced them with the same warmth. She was building a family, not the traditional way, not in her youth, but in her 50s and 60s, piece by piece, relationship by relationship. Family isn't just biology, she told me. It's choosing to show up, to care, to invest in people's lives. I'm finally learning that. On their 3rd anniversary, Aunt Margaret and James took a week off to rent a cottage on the coast. Just the two of them. No family, no distractions. They spent their days walking on the beach, reading, talking for hours the way they had when they first reconnected. One evening, sitting on the porch watching the waves, Aunt Margaret turned to James. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if we'd stayed together? If you'd never gone to London?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But I don't regret the life I lived, Maggie. I loved Catherine. I'm grateful for our children, for the career I built, for all of it. And you had your bookshop, your independence, everything you created for yourself." "I know. I don't regret it either. But sometimes I wonder about the parallel universe where we got it right the first time." "We got it right this time," he said firmly. "That's what matters. We weren't ready then, not really. We had things we needed to do, people we needed to become. And now we're here, fully ourselves, choosing each other with no illusions about what love requires." "Do you think we would have made it if we'd married at 22? Honestly? Probably not. We were too young, too unsure of ourselves. We would have wanted different things at different times. One of us would have resented the other's choices." He took her hand. "But now? Now we both know who we are. We've both lived full lives. We're not trying to find ourselves through each other. We're bringing two complete people together." "I spent so long being afraid of this," she admitted. "Afraid of needing someone, of being vulnerable, of loving someone enough that losing them would destroy me. And now I know that the fear isn't as important as the love. That yes, one of us will lose the other eventually. That's the deal. But the time we have together is worth that eventual pain." "You know what I love most about us?" James said. "We don't have the luxury of complacency. We can't take each other for granted because we know our time is limited. So we choose each other every day. We show up. We do the work. We don't wait for someday because we know someday might not come." Aunt Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I'm so glad you walked into my bookshop that day." "Me too. Best decision I ever made. Coming to Charleston, looking you up, taking that chance. Were you nervous before you came in?" "Terrified," he admitted. "I stood outside for 10 minutes arguing with myself. What if you didn't remember me? What if you were happily married? What if you'd changed so much we had nothing to say to each other? And what made you finally walk in?" I thought about all the regrets I already carried, all the what-ifs and maybes that keep you up at night, and I decided I didn't want to add another one. Even if you'd turned me away, at least I would have tried. She turned to kiss him, slow and sweet. "Thank you for trying. Thank you for saying yes." As I watched Aunt Margaret and James build their life together over those years, I learned things I'd never expected. About love, about timing, about second chances. I learned that love doesn't expire at 30 or 40 or 50, that your heart doesn't calcify with age. If anything, it becomes more capable of deep feeling, more appreciative of genuine connection. I learned that being alone and being lonely are different things, that Aunt Margaret's years of independence weren't wasted or sad. They were necessary. She needed to know she could stand on her own before she could choose to stand beside someone. I learned that love the second or third or fourth time around is different from young love. It's less dramatic but more sustainable, less about passion and more about partnership, less about finding yourself and more about choosing to grow together. I learned that timing matters, that James and Aunt Margaret wouldn't have worked at 22 or even at 35. They needed to live their separate lives, love other people, experience loss and joy and growth. They needed to become fully themselves before they could come together. I learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, especially as you age. That opening your heart when you know exactly how much it can hurt, when you've already experienced loss, that takes more courage than falling in love when you're young and still believe you're invincible. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late. Never too late to take a chance, to open yourself to possibility, to choose love over fear. It's been 5 years now since James walked into the bookshop. Aunt Margaret is 58, James is 61, and they've built a life that seems, from the outside, remarkably ordinary, and yet somehow magical. They still have coffee in the conservatory every morning, still take walks through historic Charleston, still read together in companionable silence. James has his architecture consulting. Aunt Margaret has her bookshop. They visit Emma and Ryan and the grandchildren regularly. They've taken 3 more international trips and are planning a 4th. But they've also faced challenges. James's arthritis makes some activities difficult. Aunt Margaret had a cancer scare last year that turned out to be benign, but reminded them both that time is precious. They've learned to navigate the complexities of aging together, the small frustrations and larger fears, the adjustments and accommodations. People ask me if I regret waiting so long, Aunt Margaret told me recently. If I wish I'd found this sooner, had more time. What do you tell them? That I wouldn't change anything. Every single experience in my life, the loneliness, the independence, the mistakes, the growth, led me to this moment. Led me to be the person who could love James the way he deserves to be loved. Led me to appreciate what we have. Last week, I found her in the conservatory early in the morning, before the shop opened. She was sitting with her coffee, watching the sunrise paint the glass walls with light, a book forgotten in her lap. "Can't sleep?" I asked. She smiled. Didn't want to. James is still asleep, and I wanted a few minutes alone with my thoughts. "Everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," she said simply. I was just thinking about how different my life is from what I expected. I thought I'd mapped out my whole future, the bookshop, my independence, my carefully constructed solitude. And then James showed up and changed everything. Do you miss it? The simplicity of being alone? Sometimes, she admitted. There are moments when I miss the freedom of only having to consider myself. But they're fleeting, because the truth is, this is better. Not because James completes me or because I need him to be whole, but because loving him, being loved by him, building this life together, it's expanded who I am, made me braver, made me more capable of joy. She looked at me seriously. "Sophie, I know you're still healing from your divorce, and I know it's tempting to do what I did, to build walls and convince yourself that being alone is enough. But don't wait as long as I did to let someone in. Yes, be independent. Yes, know yourself. Yes, learn to be happy on your own. But don't be so afraid of being hurt that you miss out on love. Don't let 30 years pass before you take a chance." "I'm not sure I'm as brave as you," I confessed. "You are," she said firmly, "and when the right person comes along, you'll know. Not because they complete you or fix you or save you, but because being with them makes you more yourself, not less. Because they don't ask you to be smaller or quieter or different. Because loving them makes you want to be braver." James emerged from the house then, his hair rumpled from sleep, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. He handed one to Aunt Margaret and sat beside her, and she leaned into him with the ease of long familiarity. "Morning," he said, kissing her temple. "Morning," she replied, smiling up at him. And in that moment, watching them sit together in their glass garden, surrounded by books and flowers and the quiet joy of companionship, I understood what Aunt Margaret had been trying to tell me. Love doesn't end after youth. It doesn't expire at 40 or 50 or 60. It's there, waiting, for anyone brave enough to reach for it. And sometimes, the best love stories are the ones that take decades to unfold, that come when you're ready for them, that bloom in the autumn of your life with all the richness and depth that only time and experience can bring. Epilogue. 5 years later. I'm writing this on the day of Aunt Margaret's 60th birthday. The bookshop is hosting a celebration. Friends, family, customers old and new, all gathered to honor this woman who has touched so many lives. Emma is here with her 3 children. Caroline, now a bright-eyed 5-year-old who wants to be just like Grandma Maggie. Ryan came from Seattle with his partner and their newly adopted daughter. My mother is crying happy tears. My grandmother, now 92, keeps telling anyone who will listen that she knew it would work out. And in the middle of it all are Aunt Margaret and James, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something one of the children said. They look good, happy, settled, like they've always been together, even though it's only been 7 years. Like they'll be together forever, even though they know better than anyone that forever is shorter than we'd like. Aunt Margaret catches my eye across the room and smiles, and I smile back, thinking about all the things her love story has taught me. About patience and timing, about courage and vulnerability, about the fact that life can surprise you, that doors can open when you least expect them, that it's never too late to write a new chapter. I've started dating again, carefully and slowly, with Aunt Margaret's words echoing in my mind. I'm not rushing into anything, but I'm not hiding either. I'm staying open to possibility, to connection, to the idea that my own love story might still be waiting to be written. As the party winds down and the guests start to leave, I help clean up while Aunt Margaret and James sit in the conservatory, just the 2 of them, talking quietly. Through the glass walls, I can see them holding hands, their heads close together, still finding things to say after 7 years together and 32 years apart. And I think, this is what love looks like. Not the dramatic passion of youth, not the fairy tale romance of movies and novels. But this, 2 people who found their way back to each other, who chose love over fear, who built something real and lasting and beautiful. 2 people who prove that it's never too late, that life doesn't end at any age, that the heart remains capable of wonder and joy and deep, sustaining love no matter how many years have passed. My aunt fell in love at 53. She married at 54. She's been building a life with her partner ever since, day by ordinary day, choice by brave choice. And she's never been happier. The end. Author's note: love doesn't have an expiration date. Second chances are real, and sometimes the best parts of life come in the chapters we thought were already written. May we all be brave enough to stay open to possibility, no matter our age.